Hello and welcome to my Nikon Z8 versus the Nikon Z7 II review. So today I'm going to be talking to you about the differences in both these cameras and which one is right for you and your style of photography. And yes, they are completely different animals. Now, as you probably know, I love my Z8. I absolutely love this camera. This is my favorite camera since the D850. But in saying that, there are shoots where I take out my Z7 II. Now, why is that? Well, let's get into it and I'll tell you all about it. So let's start with the Nikon Z8, or my new baby, or my new favorite camera. Now, the first thing you'll notice about this camera, and the first thing I noticed about this camera, which again is something you may not get in the spec sheet. Yes, you can see it's higher. Yes, you can see it's a small bit heavier and whatnot. But the first time I opened this camera out of the box, I was immediately struck by how absolutely normal it was. And straight away, I thought of that as a massive negative. And I just was so totally unimpressed. I was expecting something new, something different. But it was only after playing with it for about 5 or 10 minutes I realised, hey wait, this feels so familiar because it actually feels like my Nikon D850. And I absolutely love and adore this camera. And one of the reasons why I love it is the height, the extra grip. This feels like a proper digital SLR camera. It's not one of those small, pokey little mirrorless cameras like the Z7 Mark II. My baby finger or my small finger, there's no place for it in the grip. It's constantly falling off. And the other thing you'll notice is it actually digs into the palm of your hand because it's not resting on the bottom bone here. If you're hand holding the camera for 5, 6, 7, 8 hours like I frequently do in commercial shoots, this is an awful pain in the backside. Just being brutally honest with you, I really don't like that. Now you can negate that. I bought an L bracket for the Z7 Mark II and then that extends the grip. But I'm just saying straight out of the box, the first thing I noticed about the Z8 and the first massive positive is the grip, the weight, the feel of the camera. It just felt normal and it just felt right in my hand immediately. So the grip being bigger is one massive positive. The second thing, that small bit of extra weight is really nice if you're using a longer telephoto lens or even using something like the 24-70 f2.8. It kind of balances the camera and the camera balances really well. Whereas before with even the Z7 II, what I'd find is the camera feels a small bit light and a bit like, it shouldn't be on the back of this big lens. So that was one of the things I loved about the Z8 and one of the things that I think is a real positive for the camera, especially if you're going to be hand holding it for a long period of time. The next huge advantage of the Z8 of course has to be the high frames per second burst mode you can record in this. You can record at 20 frames per second, which is completely ridiculous, and the Z7 Mark II just can't compare to that. It's as simple as that. And a little sub thing from that then is the buffer. There's a massive buffer in the Nikon Z8 in comparison to the Z7 Mark II, especially considering the fact you can shoot at 20 frames per second. It's just completely ridiculous. The next thing then is the autofocus. The autofocus on the Nikon Z8 is far superior to the Z7 Mark II. I don't care what anyone says, I've used both these cameras for a long time now, and there is no way I would compare the autofocus between the Z8 and the Z7 Mark II. This is just an awful lot better. If you're shooting things like IAF, you're shooting in low light situations, or you're shooting wildlife, anything along those lines, or even 3D tracking or something, this just performs beautifully. The Z7 Mark II always kind of felt a bit, will it, won't it get the shot? Whereas the Z8 nails the shot nearly every single time, which is an absolutely massive advantage to the Nikon Z8. The next one is a slightly funny one. Colours. I just find the colour reproduction on the Nikon Z8 is just fractionally better than the Z7 Mark II. I've always had a slight issue with the Z7 Mark II. I've always found it verging slightly more towards green in the highlights and shadows and things like that, especially if you're boosting your exposure or you're shooting in very bright scenes. Whereas the Z8, so far, I'm really happy with. Now it is absolutely minor and I am probably hypercritical of that because colour correction or colour accuracy is incredibly important to me and the type of work I do, but I genuinely found the Z8 definitely has a slight leg up there too as well. Another tiny little advantage the Nikon Z8 has is the mechanical shutter that pops down when you're changing lenses. Now you can choose to enable this or disable this. It's enabled in my camera always because if you're changing your lens in dusty environments, it just helps keep dust off the sensor itself. That is something that I think should have always been in mirrorless cameras, but I'm really, really happy to have that in the Nikon Z8. The final big difference, and this is an absolutely massive one, especially if you shoot video. If you shoot video, it has to be the Nikon Z8. It's as simple as that. Between 8K, all the different codecs you can use in the camera itself, internal RAW recording, and then the improved AF to go hand in hand with all that. It is just streaks ahead of the Nikon Z7 Mark II. They're two completely different animals. So if you're a hybrid shooter, the Z8 has to be your choice. It really and truly has to be your choice. So after reviewing all that, you might be thinking, oh my God, that's it, Kieran, that's the end. No point going on anymore. What can the Z7 Mark II possibly do that's going to compete with the Z8? Well, I'm going to talk you through that part now. So the Z7 Mark II, what are the big advantages in this camera? And I'm going to be a small bit hypocritical here now, because I said earlier the size and weight of the Z8 are a massive advantage for it. But the size and weight of the Z7 Mark II are also a massive advantage for this camera. If you're going hiking, if you're doing travel photography, if you want to travel really light somewhere, the Z7 Mark II is not only going to save you weight on the camera itself, it's also going to save you weight on additional batteries, and it's also going to save you size. So you'll fit a lot more into your camera bag with the Z7 Mark II in comparison to the Z8. And the other thing, just on the weight side of things, and a little sub-issue is, if you're using the camera on a gimbal a lot, the Z8 is quite a bit bulkier, it's quite a bit heavier, not all gimbals will take it. Whereas the Z7 Mark II, most of the gimbals will take this camera. So again, a small little plus there for the Z7 Mark II. So the next thing is dynamic range. And yes, there is a difference between the dynamic range in the Z7 Mark II and the Z8, with the Z7 Mark II being capable of recording a higher dynamic range than the Z8. Now, there isn't a massive amount in it, but it is something I've noticed. And where I've noticed it is shooting straight into the setting sun, bright light firing straight down along the lens, even if I'm using a 3-stop or a 4-stop graduated filter to darken down the actual highlights in the sun and whatnot, and in the sky and reflections off the water. That dark foreground or my shadow details then, let's say rocks or whatever else, I have to boost the shadow details in that, boost the overall exposure, and drop down the highlights. And what I found is, on the Z8, I'm getting just that bit more noise than I am in the Z7 Mark II. It's not massive, but it is there, and I really and genuinely have noticed it. And I've noticed it in quite a few of my photographs. And once or twice at the very start, I found myself thinking, damn it, I should have brought out the Z7 Mark II today. So when you think about it, this camera isn't definitely for everyone. Now the other thing that's very similar to that then is high ISO performance. The high ISO performance on the Z7 Mark II versus the Z8, the Z7 Mark II is better. But again, only fractionally. And you might think I'm being hypercritical here, and if you see photographs of the two of them being compared, you'll say, God, there isn't much of a difference, Kieran. But it's if you need to make any slight adjustments like boosting shadows or whatever else again, that is where you're going to see more of a difference between the two of these. Again, not huge, but it is something worthwhile knowing. The battery performance in the Z7 Mark II is a lot better than the Z8. The Z8, because of the faster AF engine and the faster X-Speed processor inside it, it eats through your batteries quicker than your Z7 Mark II will. Now there isn't a massive difference, but there is a difference there now again. So the next thing then is price. And yes, Kieran, that is blatantly obvious. There is a price difference in the two of these cameras. But the price difference is €1,600. Let me just say that again. There is €1,600 of a price difference between the Z7 Mark II and the Z8. So if you do macro photography, if you shoot landscapes, if you shoot still life, you're certainly not going to benefit by buying the Nikon Z8. So just be cautious of that. Do not throw away €1,600. You would probably be better off with the Z7 Mark II. And then you can go out, you can buy yourself a dedicated macro lens like the 105mm Nikon Z lens, which is an absolutely cracking macro lens. Or even if you're shooting landscapes, go away and buy the 14-30 f4, which is about €1,300 or so. So you can actually buy this camera and have €200 or €300 in your back pocket in comparison to just buying the Z8. Now these are my personal opinions on these two cameras. You could see them completely differently or have a different opinion or experience with both these cameras. And if you have, please let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Or if you're actually thinking about one or two of these cameras and can't decide, I'd love to hear which one you go with and why? What was it that swayed you towards one camera over the other? I'm going to completely confuse you now because I also have another review of the Z7 Mark II versus the Z6 Mark II, and I'm going to leave that at the end of the video so you can watch that one then if you want. But I just highlight the differences in both those cameras and again, which one might be right for you. So you could end up thinking, should I buy the Z8 and then going away and buying the Z6 Mark II? So in conclusion, which one is better? They're both cameras. They're tools. Now, obviously the right tool for the job is going to seriously help you and your photography, but you can capture amazing photographs with either of the two of these cameras. If I was pushed, which one would I buy? Well, it's obviously going to be the Z8. Everyone knows I love this camera, so it just had to be the Nikon Z8. And why would I buy that? So if you're shooting portraits, if you're shooting wildlife photography, if you're shooting sports, if you're shooting anything with moving subjects, this camera is going to be brilliant. If you're shooting still life, macro work, landscapes, anything along those lines, this camera is going to be every bit as good. It's not quite as clear cut as you might think. I personally use the Z7 Mark II when I go out shooting landscapes more than I use the Nikon Z8 recently. It's just size, weight, things like that. I'm not hand holding it, higher dynamic range, things like that, even though it's fractional. But I suppose photography is about pushing your image to the absolute max. So why not go for something that's just fractionally better? It might be the slight thing that gives you that edge. So thanks again for watching. I hope this video helped you, and I hope it answered some of your questions. If you're more confused than ever, then let me know in the comments down below too as well. I genuinely hope you're not, and I genuinely hope this did help. So see you out there everyone, mind yourselves, and talk to you soon.